just out of curiosity, how many people here have used a print dictionary in the last month? Wow, God, I'm impressed, that's great. Sorry? As a dictionary, yes. Well, in fact, even 15 years ago, I was at a linguistics conference, and someone presented entirely seriously the point that that electronic dictionaries were the only thing you should use, and that the only practical purpose for print dictionaries pressing flowers or stopping doors. I disagree with him, but he presented this completely seriously. Anyway, I'm very happy to hear that so many people are using print dictionaries, something which I do think is their time is very short. The dictionary tradition in English is extremely short, actually, not just for print, now. The amount of time we've had things that we can recognize as dictionaries is really about 300 years or so. Before then, you had various dictionary-like things you would have from the oldest period of English, pre 1000 or so. You had glossaries of Latin and Old English scribbled in margins of manuscripts and things like that. From the 15th century onward, you had more elaborate things. You had glossaries, either manuscript or published dictionaries, translating Latin or French to English. And in the 16th century, you had these dictionaries of special subjects. So agriculture was a big one, seafaring, rhetoric. But not general dictionaries such as we understand them. And in fact, even when the first monolingual dictionaries appeared, the first one in 1604, Robert Caudry's A Table Alphabetical, in which he spent quite a bit of time in the introduction discussing the process of alphabetization, how to look up words, that if you have a word that begins with CA, you look at the first part of C, but if it begins with CU, you go to the last part of C, which was necessary at the time. The whole concept of dictionaries at this point were just devoted to hard words. So, Caudry's dictionary had words that were hard, but actually used, but some of the later 17th century dictionaries were words that were not used at all, words that never appeared in English, just these elaborate Latin words with these elaborate definitions. And the whole point was for people who were, a newly literary class, being able to learn the hard words of the language, the alleged hard words of the language, that they would never see. Of course, they couldn't see, these weren't real words, but they could feel better about themselves. They're learning hard words. This is how lawyers speak. This is how professional people speak, and these are the words you should know. You don't start seeing dictionaries that resemble modern ones until really the early 18th century. So some of the early ones, John Kersey's New English Dictionary of 1702. This, for example, was the first dictionary to include the word girl. The entire definition was a wench. But nonetheless, the point is that before then, before 1700 or so, the idea of having a dictionary that would include the words that you already know, there was no point to this. We know them. There's no need to look them up. And in fact, this is a concept one still sees nowadays. You often, well, not often, but there are dictionaries out there that are just devoted to hard words because we know the other ones. We don't need them. Here are ones usually for the purpose of impressing people or with humorous definitions. But back then, that's all they had. Nathan Bailey's Dictionarium Britannicum of 1730, very different dictionary, much larger, and some of the features you see then in dictionaries of this period, again, the common words were in. You would have these esoteric Latinisms in the 17th century dictionaries. These were specifically excluded. You would have an emphasis on science and industry. This was the most important thing of the time. The idea that nowadays, internet and computers and all this, like now we care about scientific vocabulary, they were really concerned about scientific vocabulary at the time. And in their prefaces of these dictionaries, they would spend a lot of space talking about industrial terms and mining terms and agricultural implements and how these were treated in the dictionary and how you could learn things from them. They were just as concerned with technology then as we are now. And the dictionaries reflect that. Illustrations for the first time. And etymological information, which again, as in Webster at this point, the etymologies were completely worthless. Really, it isn't until the mid-19th century that etymologies and dictionaries were useful at all, but they were in there. The first really great dictionary we have is Johnson's Dictionary of 1755, which most people will have heard of maybe only as a joke in a Blackadder episode. Johnson's dictionary didn't actually do anything completely new. Everything that's in Johnson was in some other dictionary in some form, but usually not very well done. One of the things that Johnson did, he had a tremendous number of illustrative quotations. So not only would he have a definition, but he would have examples from usually major authors showing how these words were used. And in Johnson's dictionary, there were about 100,000 of these, and that's a tremendous number. A full third of these were from Shakespeare, Milton, or the King James Bible, showing how important he thought these authors were, and also helped cement their reputation at the time. He had treatment of polysemous entries as ones with multiple senses. Before then, you typically would have a word, and you would just have one definition covering every sense that that word might have. Johnson split things up into many different senses. I'll show an example in a sec. And usage labeling, so that words that were technical or that were considered slang would have a label indicating that. Now, a great definition a great example rather of how we would do this. In Bailey's dictionary of 1730, the entire definition for think was to meditate, suppose, or be of an opinion. That's it. Johnson's entry actually went on somewhat longer than this, but he broke it up into 8 or 9 different senses, different senses, and these were illustrated with many dozens of quotes from Locke, Dryden, Addison, the King James Bible, Shakespeare, Swift, and more. And it's hard to convey just how great this was. I mean, this is an absolute masterpiece of analysis, not least because no one had done this beforehand, so you couldn't see how someone else did and said, oh, well, I'm going to change these things or add another sense. This is all his. It's really an incredible effort to do this. Meanwhile, in America, Noah Webster, he had earlier works, but the great work was the American Dictionary of the English Language. Webster was from a very respected but poor family. He was connected to some of the most important people in the early 17th century colonies. He went to Yale during the Revolutionary War and tried unsuccessfully to work as both a lawyer and a schoolmaster, but he had great success with the American Spelling Book, which first came out in 1783. This was the best-selling book in the 19th century, apart from the Bible. It sold, estimates of how far the American Spelling Book sold in the 19th century run to around 100 million copies. And Noah Webster did a lot of other important things. He helped establish copyright law. He founded the first daily newspaper in New York City. If he hadn't written a dictionary, he would still be very important. But the dictionary itself is a great thing. And he was he was strongly jingoistic. He thought American English, he coined the term American English as Noah Webster's coinage. And he very strongly thought that American English was a separate thing from British English, needed to be treated separately, needed its own dictionary. Webster's dictionary had a number of great features. Again, like many of the early ones, a lot of scientific and technical terms, included Americanisms for the first time, so plantation, levee, coyote, squash, skunk, prairie. These are terms from Spanish, French, Indian languages, quotations from American authors, great definitions. Johnson had very good definitions, but Johnson's skill was in other things. Webster was a really great definer. So Johnson's definition of the word label, for example, was a small slip or scrap of writing. Not too bad, you get the idea across. Webster's was a narrow slip of silk, paper, or parchment containing a name or title and affixed to anything denoting its contents. This is a good definition. Noah Webster was a great definer. And the Brits in particular who have guided the debate over this, all think that Webster was just copying from Johnson, which he did, but in fact, Webster on his own was a much better definer than Johnson. Nonetheless, Johnson in England and Webster in America were regarded as the great dictionaries, and for a long time there were no serious attempts to produce anything scholarly that would supplant them. But by the middle of the 19th century, scholars started to realize that we needed something new, that they needed something new. And the idea that the things that led to what became the Oxford English Dictionary were planted at this time, the seeds. In 1857, the Philological Society in London, which was a scholarly organization, started. Richard Chenevix Trench, the Dean of Westminster, later Archbishop of Dublin, presented a series of papers arguing called On Some Deficiencies in Our English Dictionaries, a great history of English dictionaries up to that time, which not only discussed the problems with them, but the solutions, what we needed to have in a dictionary that would fix all these problems. So some of the things that he suggested were that obsolete words should be treated well, not just ignored because they were too old. That citations, the quotations showing how these should be used, they shouldn't just say Shakespeare or just have a quote without indicating where they're from. They should be accurately dated so you could tell how old these words were and when they had been used. The sources should be wide-ranging. It shouldn't just be literary sources. Johnson was almost entirely using literary authors. The OED, what became the OED, said everything: technical sources, newspapers, anything. And that the lexicographer, the role of lexicography was not as a moralist telling you how you should speak, but as a historian saying, this is how the language works. This is how the language has always worked. Here's how things have been spoken, and we are just reporting on it. Trench's chalk was met with great enthusiasm. There was a lot of preparation done. It took a long time before the dictionary started to appear. But the historical method is the important thing about this dictionary. And as an example of how this works, here is the entry from a modern entry. This is the entry from Oxford Dictionaries Online, our main, the dictionary, not the OED, for the word skyscraper. It has a pronunciation. This is a complete entry. There's no etymology. There's just a pronunciation. And two definitions, nothing else. The first, noun, giving part of speech, noun, a very tall building of many stories, and then another term for a sky soul. Not the most common sense, but it's there. Those are the common, those are the current things. What you get when you look this up in the OED is something very different. This is the first page of entries for skyscraper. None of these are the definition of very tall building. There are a bunch of tall things. The first one is the one we just saw, a triangular sky soul. There's a pronunciation, there is a small etymology here. And underneath each definition here are quotations showing from how this has developed, ranging from the earliest you can find to the most recent. And there are 6 things here. There's another sense which I'm not bothering to show, all for things that are relatively tall. And we haven't even seen the only sense that's in current use, which is on the second page. This is the modern sense, a high building of many stories, especially one of those characteristic of American cities, with quotations from 1883 and 1888 from a Chicago newspaper talking about the skyscrapers of Chicago. So if we want to know how old the term skyscraper is in the building sense, this is it. This is how you find out. And this is the purpose of the OED. This is the purpose of historical dictionaries. If you want to know, whether people said parenting in 1920, as they did on Downton Abbey the other day, you could look it up in the OED and say, no, parenting in 1920 is completely anachronistic. And you can't do that with any other kind of dictionary. This is why you have dictionaries like this. So there are a lot of other historical dictionaries for different languages, for different national varieties and regional varieties, for different chronological varieties. Here, this is the Middle English Dictionary, the Old English Dictionary, for registers of English, Green's Dictionary of Slang, a three large volume dictionary of slang. All on this general principle, where you have quotations showing how these things are used, and showing how the language works. When the OED started, the hard part of all this is gathering the evidence. It's much easier nowadays that we have computers, but back then the way you did it was crowdsourcing. The term crowdsource was coined in 2006, but in fact the OED is perhaps the first actually crowdsourced project we have. What James Murray, who's the first editor of the OED, did was had an appeal for help to the English-speaking and English-reading public. He posted advertisements in newspapers and literary magazines, basically asking people for help. If you read, if you're interested in the language, please write in. We will send you things to read. When you find interesting things in them, send them in to us on slips of paper. And you do this for enough years, and you have millions and millions of slips of paper in the files, and you sort through them, and you write your dictionary based on the evidence. And that is how the OED was developed then, and that is how it is more or less still developed now, with, again, using a lot of bigger computers, but the idea is still the same. So the OED appeared over a course of 44 years, from 1884 to 1928. This is still pretty fast. It might seem like a long time. In fact, that's really fast. Some others, the Grimm Brothers Dictionary, the Deutsches Wörterbuch, about 120 years to produce. The Wörterbuch der Nederlandische Taal, which is the Dutch historical dictionary, took 130 years or so. Even the much smaller Gerardo Privisgol Cymru, which is the Welsh historical dictionary, took 80 years. It's only 4 volumes long. The Spanish Academy is currently working on a dictionary. They've been going since 1940, and they are still in A. So getting the OED done in 12 volumes in 44 years is actually a remarkable achievement. What's happened since then? The OED was finished in 1928. In 1933, it was reissued with a supplement that took care of a lot of things that were missing during the editorial process, that were realized is missing during the editorial process. In the 1970s and 80s, Robert Birchfield, who was a New Zealand medievalist, produced 4 very large supplementary volumes consisting mostly of 19th and 20th century new words. And in 1989, what was called the second edition of the OED was published. This was not a true second edition. The dictionary wasn't really revised at all. What the second edition did was take the text of the first edition and take Birchfield's supplements and combine them into one coherent text. But the core of the dictionary was unchanged. So if you look at older entries, or really any entry, that's not extremely modern, the latest quotations would be from the late 19th century, and the definitions would be written in a very old style. And it was clear that, that the OED needed to be updated. And this process started as soon as the second edition was finished, work started on it. The publication began online in 2000 with the letter M. So every quarter we would have updates with revised entries in alphabetical sequence. And then from 2001, new entries from anywhere they would appear in the alphabet. So words like internet or World Wide Web could go in without having to wait 20 years until we get around to that part of the alphabet. People would often, and from 2008, the big thing now we're doing is revised entries appearing out of sequence. So not just progressing through the alphabet from M onwards, but important words that we wanted to treat whenever we could. So art, air, cancer, computer, heaven, human, jazz, life, love, social, word. Now, these are things that we've worked on now. I mean, currently I'm working the editing for great and everything connected to that, all the compounds of that. People say, why do we start at M? And we usually say, well, that way we get to Z faster. The real answer is on this slide, which is hard to read, but there's an entry missing here. It's very hard to tell what entry is missing when you look at it. The entry that's missing on this slide, this is from OED 1, is the entry for African. The word African didn't appear in the first edition of OED, not because the word didn't exist or because the OED editors were racist, but because originally the editorial principle was, there was an editorial decision made that that proper nouns and words formed from proper nouns wouldn't go into the OED. That these were the province of the encyclopedia rather than the dictionary. And the fact that this was a problem was realized almost immediately. In fact, once you get a few pages into the dictionary into American, you find American isn't there, but African isn't. So this is the example. This is the kind of reason why you need to edit things. Here's another example: the entry for jazz, which has a very short etymology, origin unknown, see quotes for some of many suggested derivations, and the definition which refers to a type of music originating among American Negroes, and a first quotation from 1909. There are problems with every aspect of this treatment, which I don't have time to discuss, but just as an example of how big this is, here's this is the revised entry. What's here on screen, which I know you can't really read, this is just the first half of the etymology only, so what an OED 2 was one line is now an entire page or more, and a well-revised entry, for a definition and entry for the music sense itself, which is sense 3A. There are 4 senses which come before this, with the first quotation from 1915. The 1909 quotation, as it turns out, was fake. It wasn't really from 1909. It was from a later phonograph record from 1919, but someone had misdated it. So fixing this is again, one of the reasons why we're here today. One of the big transformations I mentioned before is having access to full-text databases that allow us to search enormous quantities of data and find the information we need easily for certain values, for some values of easily. It takes a lot of time to look through these things, but the things that you can get from it, these are some improvements in the first quotes. Ankle biter is a term for small child. The earliest evidence for this went back, over 100 years. Atom bomb, the first example in OED 2 is from 1945. Now we have an example from 1921, long before we had an atom bomb. Noodle, meaning the head or intelligence, going back over a whole 100 years. Oldie, which seems like a very modern colloquial term, going back to 1799. Salsa, sauce, 1846, going back to 1693. This is what you can do with Google Books, with early English books online, with things like that. So the future of OED, I know I'm running out of time here, but this is how fast we're progressing. Well, the answer is very. We have over 1 million more quotes just in the last 10 years that we've added to the dictionary. We're currently 38% of the way through the editorial process, and we hope to finish in a couple of decades, although we're not exactly sure how long it will take. One of the questions people ask about the future of the OED will the OED ever be printed again? The answer is, we don't know. This doesn't mean we know that it won't. People, we say this all the time, that we have not decided, and people think that this means that we have decided not to. We simply don't know at this point what the market will be for a 40-volume physically printed dictionary, because that is how large it will be at the rate we're going. We don't know, no one knows what the market will be for 40-volume physically printed dictionary in 20 years or so. So we are editing with an eye towards print. We hope that, that we will, in fact, get done with it, and we will be able to print it, but we just don't know. I'm out of time, I know. This is an example of the kind of thing that you can do. There are so many ways you can link up dictionary text to other things. Instead of just having quotations, those quotations can link to the full text of these things, can link to the Dictionary of National Biography entry for those things. This is an example of what's called the Historical Thesaurus of English. On the screen, which was a 50-year effort to basically reverse engineer the OED into a thesaurus. So now this has been linked into the OED itself. So if you look up a word like shirt, you see here what pops up on the side is the thesaurus for this, showing other words for shirt from every period of English. So examples of words meaning shirt. If you want to know words for shirt from the 18th century, you can do that. And you can then click through to variants of that. So this is the breakdown of words for articles of clothing, and then things you wear on the upper half of the body, and then undergarments and so forth. So this kind of thing, linking massive quantities of text, together, in ways that we still don't know how this will work. But this is the way that dictionaries are going, I think, and this is what we should expect from historical dictionaries in the future. And I'll stop now and take any questions with the time I don't have left. Thank you very much.